Hi everybody, good morning. It's my great pleasure to introduce Nora Jaffary from Professor of History at Concordia University in Montreal, who's making her post-shutdown return to Queens. A few of you may remember meeting her several years back when she was visiting in a more administrative capacity as a department chair in history, looking into certain aspects of our program here. That, of course, went into a report that Nora says ended up on a shelf, like all reports always end up. It is much more rewarding to have her here as a scholar today, because an accomplished scholar she is. She received her PhD in 2000 from Columbia University and specializes in gender, medicine, crime, deviancy, race, and religion. Her 2016 book, Reproduction and Its Discontents in Mexico, Childbirth and Contraception from 1750 to 1905, which was UNC-Chapel Hill Press, was winner of the Wallace Ferguson Prize for the best book by a Canadian in non-Canadian history, and honorable mention for the Howard F. Cline Prize in Mexican history from the Latin American Studies Association, which I think is particularly impressive because it's a prize for which works in English and Spanish are both eligible, and the number of books on Mexican history published in Spanish on a yearly basis is pretty huge. What impresses me as much or more about Nora is that she is the rare Latin Americanist whose work and teaching spans both the colonial period and the 19th century. Her other books are False Mystics, Deviant Orthodoxy in Colonial Mexico, University of Nebraska Press, 2008, the anthology Gender, Race, and Religion in the Colonization of the Americas, and two co-edited primary source collections, Women in Colonial Latin America, Texts and Contexts, and Mexican History, a primary source reader. Correct me if I'm wrong, but today's talk appears to trace forward in time some themes introduced in an article entitled Maternity and Morality in Puebla's 19th Century Infanticide Trials, which Nora published last year in the Law and History Review, which is a journal that if you don't know it, you should know it. The title of today's talk is Permitting and Prohibiting Abortion in Mexico, 1871 to 1952. It's again my pleasure to welcome Nora to Queens.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David, and in absentia to Jeffrey Collins for the invitation to come, and also to all of you for joining me. I know we all have a lot of competitions on our time, so it's a big commitment to show up for a talk like this, and I appreciate you being here. I'm going to talk for 51 minutes about permitting and prohibiting abortion, and I hope it provokes some questions. If something I say is not something we reach in the question and answer period, my email is there, and you can find me on the history page, and I'd be delighted to answer questions or give advice or talk about archives or anything like that if you follow up with an email at some point. Okay, so there is perhaps no question in the field of medicine that has been debated more than the question of provoked abortion. So observed physician Juan Breña, writing in the prominent medical review, the Crónica Médica Mexicana, in defense of physicians' right, indeed of their obligation, to provide surgical abortions. Performing such operations, Breña asserted, is licit and fully justified in respect of the indisputable role that women play in society and in the family. Breña did not advance this position in 1980 or in 2021, but rather in a stirring defense of women's rights to surgical abortion that he published in 1898. He made the case in an article responding to another piece that another obstetrician, Alberto Lopez Hermosa, had published in the Gazeta Médica de Mexico the previous year. and that other physician had argued that it was unethical and illicit for physicians to provoke abortions in the first 6 months of gestation. But he distinguished those from what contemporaries called artificial preterm births. And these involve the provocation of labor in the last 3 months of gestation, which even this other physician declared were perfectly licit and ethically sound and advantageous medically. But Brenya, the first person I quoted, defended the notion of surgical abortion at any stage of gestation. And he also discussed how doctors should proceed if only the pregnant woman or the unborn product of conception could be saved. He said the choice was clear. Women's lives should be privileged in such cases because of their relations in society, their importance within families, I'm quoting him, the titles that they had acquired, and their existence over many years. Only theological precepts from ancient times would accept the idea that the worth of, quote, an unbaptized fetus, unpurged from original sin, had greater value than that of an adult woman. The conflict between these two late 19th century physicians is illustrative of debates in medical and medical legal texts from the period. And these sources show that although there were some doctors who were opposed to or questioned the validity of surgical abortion, there was another prominent cadre of doctors, including Dr. Juan Maria Rodriguez, who was the most preeminent obstetrician of his day, and another doctor who I have a photo of here, Luis Hidalgo y Carpio, who I notice, and you might notice, I think visited the same tailor as Abraham Lincoln. This guy was also a defender of women's rights to surgical abortion. And I thought that was particularly interesting because he is also the man who wrote the sections of the 1871 Penal Code deciding or delineating how abortion should be treated, in what cases it should be criminalized. And I'll talk more about those elements of the code shortly. By 1900, the Escuela Nacional de Medicina, which is the preeminent medical school in Mexico, listed the performance of both abortions and embryotomies as a requirement for those seeking qualifications in the field of obstetrics. And in the first decades of the 20th century and the last decade of the 19th century, dozens of medical theses and journal articles were dedicated to the necessity of performing surgical abortions and discussing the techniques required to improve that operation. And the medical theses are those things that medical students were required to research and publish as part of their requirements for becoming a doctor. So this evidence about surgical abortion and doctors endorsing it challenges many of our, and I will put myself in the category of our, assumptions about the medical profession's historic attitude to abortion. The few scholars who have previously examined the history of abortion in Mexico in this period have concluded that institutional medicine as a whole, when I say institutional, I mean hospitals, professional organizations, the curriculum of medical schools, that those groups have condemned abortion and sort of stood as a block to it. So I'll just mention a couple. Fernanda Nunez writes, for example, that institutional medicine in this time promoted the reproduction of families and condemned abortion. And in her path-breaking research, Adriana Ortiz Ortega, she's a political scientist, but she wrote her PhD dissertation at Yale in the early 90s, and then that work kind of carried through her scholarship afterward. And she described the late 19th century in terms of what she called a gentleman's agreement, that she said the medical profession had made with the liberal state when it was crafting the 1871 Penal Code, which led, and I'll quote her, to the states compensating for the liberalization of abortion laws, which I'll talk more about in a moment, with secrecy and a failure to implement the legal options and services available to women. And those services included access to surgical abortions. And the other, just as another example of that kind of vision of institutional medicine, I'm going to show you an image that I included in my book, Reproduction and Its Discontents. This picture sort of summed up for me what I thought of as how male doctors approached obstetrics. You can see that it might not lead to really effective care. Now this was an image that came from a French tract that was first published in 1825, but it was translated into Spanish, published in Mexico, and circulated in the 19th century, and I came across people, Mexican physicians, referring to Macabier's text. So I assumed that, you know, this kind of treatment, so much modesty and kind of perhaps even repulsion would characterize doctors' attitudes, and that in that tradition of seeing midwives as the ones who were engaged in, for instance, provision of abortion care. And that's why reading the material that I've come across about doctors' involvement in abortion seemed so interesting and novel to me. The other thing I want to say as a kind of framing of this work is that it is the case that in recent decades, I mean decades to us now, institutional medicine in Mexico has been very politically opposed to the provision of abortion and have been outspoken opponents of abortion. And in fact, this opposition is one of the things that provoked an important ruling by Mexico's Supreme Court last fall. So in September of 2021, you may have heard, it was a pretty big news story, in the same week that the United States Supreme Court failed to overturn the Texas heartbeat law, that was in September of 2021, the Mexican Supreme Court, in one momentous decision, ruled that penalizing abortion was unconstitutional. And then a few days later, it issued two other decisions. I'll mention one of them now, and I can tell you about the other one in the Q&A if you're interested. But the second one was that it also overturned a 2018 law, the General Law of Health. And that law had been introduced as a way of allowing the medical profession to conscientiously object to the performance of medical procedures, including abortion. And so the Supreme Court decision said that that law was illegal and that the medical personnel could not conscientiously object to the performance of procedures, quote, without establishing limits necessary to ensure patients' rights to health care. And what the ruling was addressing was this history in recent decades of reluctance to provide abortions, which had come to national attention first in 1999 and 2000 in a fairly famous criminal case called the Paulina case, which, again, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, I'm supposed to be talking about the 19th century more here, but I'd be happy, again, if you're interested in that case, I could give you the background about it after, but that ruling brought up this kind of awareness of the reluctance of doctors to provide abortion even when they were lawful. So it's apparent that in the late 20th century, there is this reluctance of the medical profession to engage in abortion, but the evidence that I've come across shows that there was an earlier period of about 50 years when doctors were providing abortion. So this is what I'm examining is that history of where that came from, what it constituted, and then I'm trying to account for the change. When did the turn happen toward kind of opposition to abortion. And I'm going to mention also the work of another historian, Elizabeth O'Brien, who is working on the kind of history of surgical obstetrics in general terms. She's a historian at Johns Hopkins History of Medicine program, and my work is very much in dialogue with hers. Although in some places I will point out where she and I go in slightly different directions. So what I'm going to do today, this has been kind of setting up the topic, is I'm going to start by going through the criminal code, how it regulated abortion. Then I'll get into a discussion that's kind of the heart of the talk about this, what surgical abortions look like and what people were publishing about. Then I'll document the turn in the 50s, and in my conclusion, discuss some of the reasons why I think that happened. I think it's significant that there was this 50 or 60 year period when the medical profession was supporting surgical abortions, because it highlights the changing nature and the socially constructed nature of attitudes toward abortion, even in circles that we might think of as more socially conservative. And I also think that it's important because, in my view, the most crucial organization that was an obstruction to increasing abortion access in the recent decades was not the Catholic Church. Many people, since I've been working on reproductive history, have assumed and say to me, oh, the church must be responsible for so much opposition in Mexico. And in fact, the church is, the history of Catholic objection to abortion is a lot more recent and a lot less powerful than people often assume. And the source of opposition, at least much more practically, is the medical profession recently, not the church. Okay, so I'm going to start with this discussion of the Código Penal from 1871. Let me explain a couple things about this. First of all, Mexico is a federation, and so each state has its own penal code and regulates its own criminal law, just like happens in the United States and very different from Canada. But the thing is that the federal district, the capital, what's now called La Ciudad de Mexico, often creates the first one, and then other states adopt that one or modify it very slightly. The 1871 code is also important because this was the first post-independence code. So until 1871, Mexico breaks from Spain in 1821, and in the next 50 years actually is continuing to use colonial law. And in fact, they continue to use colonial law codes well after this. Even in the 20th century, people are still referring often to medieval and early modern Castilian law. But this one becomes the most, it's kind of the new standard for what judges are supposed to apply when making rulings. So it's kind of the definitive code. It treats all aspects of crime. I'm just going to talk about the regulations about abortion. So Chapter 9, Article 569 of this code defined abortion as, quote, the extraction of the product of conception and its expulsion provoked by any means when this occurs outside the normal term of pregnancy, when this is undertaken without necessity. And it was those last two lines that were so important because there were times when it was necessary, and in those cases it wasn't even considered an abortion. Abortion was deemed necessary and permissible, and this isn't in the code, but it is in the medical literature. If a physician judged that pregnancy or birth posed the risk of death to the mother. Risks were presented by such conditions as narrow pelvises, uterine tumors, uncontrollable vomiting or bleeding, serious heart conditions, eclampsia, and something called the retroversion of the uterus, which I kept reading that and then finally looked it up and found out it refers to the fact that in most women the uterus is tilted slightly forward, and in retroversion of the uterus it's tilted a little bit vertically or to the back. And it's not a condition that is apparently a hindrance to either pregnancy or birth, and it is a condition that 20% of all women have. So it shows up here as a justification for abortion. I don't know if it was knowingly or unknowingly, not really there wasn't a medical need, but it's one of the reasons people get for why an abortion should be allowed without punishment. The code also declared that the crime should only be punished if the abortion was completed and not just attempted. It said that abortions due to negligence, so accidental, are not punishable. And then most of the other chapters dealt with the punishments that people convicted should be found to have sentenced with. So medical personnel who accidentally provoked an abortion were to lose their licenses for a year. And medical personnel, doctors or midwives, who intentionally provoked an abortion and then the patient died, this was the strictest punishment, they should be subjected to the death penalty, is what the law said. Although I have to say I have not come across any trial where that happens. But that's what the code said. And then the rest of the code talked about what should happen to the pregnant person. Generally, a woman who intentionally procured an abortion was to be punished with 2 years imprisonment, as long as she met with 3 qualifying factors. The first, and they all involve honor. The first was that she should not be a woman of ill repute, which was, or the language is mala femme. The second was that she should have tried to hide her pregnancy, so that it's more about this promotion of honor. And the third was that the fruit of conception should be the result of an extramarital relationship. So there's a different standard for a baby conceived of and then aborted within a marriage, and one conceived outside of marriage. If the third condition was not met, so if she was pregnant within a marriage and then aborted, the sentence was much stronger. It was 5 years imprisonment instead of 2. And the other conditions each added another year. In 1929, the post-revolutionary state modified the 1871 code, although that no one talks about that. The 1929 code, it wasn't accepted. There was a lot of dispute about it. So the one that matters really is the 1931 code, and that's still the current criminal code in Mexico, although in different states, have continued modifying it, which I'll talk a little bit more about. The 1931 code for abortion introduced 2 important changes. The first one was that for the first time, a woman who became pregnant as a result of rape was not to be prosecuted for abortion. And that one continues to be the case in every state in Mexico. It had maintained that regulation. And 1931 code also was the first time that the product of conception, if it presented a condition that indicated certain death during the pregnancy or shortly after it, that was also a justification for abortion. And that is referred to subsequently and in literature sort of unselfconsciously as the eugenic clause. And I'm going to come back a bit more to eugenics, but it's introduced into the penal code in a time when eugenics has a powerful following in Mexico, in criminological circles and in medical circles. Later in the 1930s, a few states modified the 1931 code involving abortion to indicate that it was lawful for women to abort when they were driven by economic necessity. That was in Yucatan, Chiapas, and Chihuahua. And in those states, it either became non-criminal to do so, or in the case of Yucatan, the sentence was lightened. It was considered an attenuating circumstance, or extenuating circumstance. Okay, so that's what the law said. Let me talk for a few moments about the practice. One thing I would say as a general point is that abortion isn't prosecuted very often. It's not prosecuted in any period in anything like the rates in which it occurred. It's not prosecuted in comparison to various other violent crimes. It's very rarely convicted. And the periods in which it has the highest numbers of prosecution or highest numbers of criminal cases opened investigating abortions is in the time period that I'm mostly talking about now. It's the last 2 decades of the 19th century, first 2 decades of the 20th century. Those have the highest numbers, although they still have lighter numbers in terms of conviction. And in those cases, most of the investigations do not involve doctors and what I'm calling surgical abortions, or what they called surgical abortions. Instead, they involve what are called medicinal abortions. So medicinal abortions, which some of you are probably familiar with because this is another theme that is very present now, are abortions that are induced through the ingestion of medicines that basically provoke early labor. It's become the most common form of abortion in the United States. It's common in Mexico, and now it's common for Mexican women to be organizing and distributing those medicines to American women because it's unlawful, or it's more threatened in various states like Texas. In the colonial period, this was the most common form of abortion, and there are medicines that I dated in Reproduction and Its Discontents that go back to the colonial period. And the pre-conquest era, the most commonly used one was called Zihuapatli, the aster flower. It releases an oxytocin, a hormone that stimulates labor and provokes labor and expulsion of the fetus and an abortion. And I found other ones in the 19th century. That one's used. The case that advertised my talk was one such case. This was from Yucatan. It happens in Merida in 1898 and 1899. This is the only criminal trial I have ever come across that has this fabulous lettering on the front page. When I saw it, I was like, it looks like a Broadway musical. Fecunda y Noberta Canche, starring in Aborto Provocado, 1899. But it was a case of induced abortion. A midwife who provided a young woman with a flowering plant from the Yucatan called verbena, that again provoked an early abortion. As in most cases, she was not found guilty, neither the midwife nor the young girl. I think she was 13. And the reason for that is that these medicines had been long used and sanctioned by medical authorities and by the state to regularize the menses. That was the language used. And people will just say, I'm just keeping my menses regular, and if that's what you're doing, there's no problem, that's not illegal. So they even have doctors in this case showing up and saying, this is just a medicine to regularize the menses, and that's fine, and they're not prosecuted. So that's kind of the shape of a lot of the abortion trials. Occasionally, in the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, there are cases of doctors or midwives who seem to be providing not medicinal but surgical abortions, and they do result in either police or criminal investigations. And I should maybe clarify now, when I say surgical, that term usually people think it means cutting. And in none of the cases that I've looked at, does abortion involve cutting? Like there aren't scalpels, people aren't getting cut open. But it does involve, and I'm going to read you a description of a 19th century abortion, it involves a physical intervention of some kind. So that's the difference. Surgery just means touching. and some kind of mechanical intervention, whereas the other kind is just indirectly through medicine. So a few of these early 20th century surgical abortions, there was one that was all over Mexican newspapers in 1898, and it eventually went to the Supreme Court, and it involved a doctor called Antonio Abrego, who had apparently performed an abortion on his lover, Maria Barrera, and she died from a hemorrhage in 1898. There was also, I found a 1907 newspaper article reporting that another physician, Dr. Rees, had been imprisoned in the Belen penitentiary after provoking the death of a patient that he had also performed apparently an abortion upon. And a 1925 abortion trial went to the Supreme Court of the Federal District that involved a midwife, Beatriz Mejia Sanchez, who had provoked an abortion in a young woman, and she also died from an infection that was contracted after the incomplete extraction of an embryo. So there are some of these cases that show up in the newspaper or sometimes in court records, but they are more atypical than typical. And what there is a lot more evidence of are medical personnel, doctors primarily, who offer surgical abortions, or I'll say mechanical abortions, as part of their legitimate caregiving repertoire. So the idea of considering this history was brought to my attention when I read something that Elizabeth O'Brien, who I mentioned earlier, had written about one of these works. And so it was this medical thesis from 1869 called Estudios sobre el aborto en Mexico. And I had read that, I read through it when I was writing Reproduction and Its Discontents, and I kind of dismissed it because it was a tract that was about what I would call more miscarriage than abortion. So that word aborto in Spanish is used to refer to both an intentional abortion and a miscarriage. And so sometimes it's difficult to tell, what are you reading about? So I just thought, oh, this one's just about miscarriage, so I'm not really that interested in that. I'm more interested in intentional miscarriage or intentional abortion. But the point that Elizabeth O'Brien made was that she thought this student was actually subtly challenging the legitimacy of abortion because his thesis came out the same year that Pope Pius IX issued a bull called Apostolica Sedis that condemned abortion and said anybody who had an abortion at any period of pregnancy was automatically excommunicated. And Elizabeth O'Brien's comment about menocall was that he showed this in the language he used to refer to the fetus. So he called the product of conception initially, he calls it very specifically an egg, and then at 3 months he starts calling it an embryo, and then at 4 months a fetus, but never sort of a human life. And so I thought that was interesting, and that was actually what led me to looking at, well, how did other doctors refer to this, and how were they thinking of it, and was that issue a moral quandary for them? And what I found was actually that that is very mild. Menocall was very mild in his comment, and if he was making a commentary, which I actually don't think he was, because he was probably writing that thesis before the bull came out. And I'm not actually sure which comes up first, his publication or the bull, but it is interesting to see how people refer to the process. So in all works and in all of the legal codes, first of all, everybody calls it the language I've been using, the product of conception. Even in the most conservative state in Mexico right now that has the most conservative abortion law, which is Querétaro, they still refer to this as the product of conception, unlike in Texas where it's called an unborn child. So that language doesn't exist in any of these tracts. But there's also a lot stronger language, actually, than that more subtle language. So, for instance, the same person I referred to at the beginning of my talk, Juan Breña, in his tract in 1898, where he's talking about, you know, the status of the unborn fetus and the value of the woman, he quotes from a French anatomist who viewed fetuses as, he uses the term nulla, or valueless, and observed that great numbers of subsequent doctors had argued, quote, "The fetus suffers no real prejudice, since it lost a life which it had not the slightest consciousness." I also found that there's evidence that doctors take the view that fetuses do not participate in humanity in criminal trials. So in one case I looked at from Yucatan, that was from 1902, from the city of Valladolid, the court investigated a man called Rudecindo May for the clandestine burial of an aborted embryo. And the court calls a couple of physicians to testify, and they declare, quote, that during the first 3 months of gestation, there is no human form present, nor is the product of conception viable, and it can be confused with coagulated blood or concretions. End quote. And since the Registro Civil, the civil registry, referred to penalties for the clandestine burial only of human cadavers, the judge dismissed the case and didn't find him guilty. And while Menopause text focused on miscarriages, accidental abortions, his tract is followed by dozens of other ones in the 1870s, 80s, 90s, and through the 1930s that involve kind of scientific studies of how to provoke preterm deliveries. These included Eduardo Navarro E. Cardona's 1873 thesis, Del Parto, and there's my standard typo on an overhead, it should say prematuro, in Mexico in 1873, on premature birth, on premature labor. This work discussed the surgical procedures for the extraction of legally viable fetuses. Those were understood as those over 6 months gestation in medically problematic preterm pregnancies. He narrated the details of several individual Mexican women's experiences with artificial preterm birth, including a 28-year-old from the capital who had endured several miscarriages relating to her suffering from various debilitating conditions, including intestinal maladies and fevers. To try assisting her in the successful delivery of a subsequent pregnancy, her attending doctors attempted to provoke birth in advance of its natural occurrence by applying dilatory sponges to her cervix, breaking the amniotic sac, and extracting the fetus through the use of forceps. In this case, the newborn died 18 hours later. A year later, they tried again. This time, they injected her uterus with water. That stimulated contractions. They conducted a podalic inversion, where the fetus is turned inside the uterus. And then, again, they used forceps to extract the fetus. And in this case, both the mother and the infant survived. And in total, he goes through 10 different kinds of deliveries of kind of provoking preterm birth. In 8 of them, the mother survived, and in 6 of them, the fetus died. So, in fact, what he's describing are very late-term abortions. Sometimes the fetus survives. I mean, it's not an abortion if the fetus survived, but sometimes the fetus survived, sometimes the fetus died. The mother generally lives, and that's what they're that's what they're investigating. That's what he's trying to perfect. Sometimes the authors of groups of texts in this era were publishing research about abortions using euphemistic language. So this next one I have listed there, Luis Troconis y Alcalà's thesis from 1885 was called In Early Pregnancy. I've just got the English part of the first part of his title. What is the best operation to effect the désoccupation de la matrice, the disoccupation of the womb? And he discusses various means by which the womb can be emptied. He also talks about having techniques to desembarazar la mujer, to depregnify a woman. So he uses this language, but that's what he's really describing. Another thesis from 1884 by Jesus Tajonar y Cardosa was called The Brief Comparative Study Between Embryotomies and Caesarean Operations. And he was considering how these things should be handled in cases of what were going to be very difficult births. And he actually advocates that embryotomies, so that is when the embryo is destroyed and then removed, so obviously fatal for the embryo, is preferable to cesarean section because it's much less risky for the pregnant woman. So he says in any case like that, it should just be straight to the embryotomy and no cesarean sections. One physician, J. Duque de Estrada, who was professor of obstetrics at the Escuela Nacional de Medicina, described his performance of a provoked abortion on a patient in an 1898 report that he published in the Crónica Médica Mexicana. His patient, a woman in the 4th month of pregnancy, suffered from what he called autointoxicación gravídica, which, as far as I can tell, meant edema. And this was, which is swelling of your body at pregnancy, and if it becomes very pronounced, that's one of the signs that you can have eclampsia, and that is a fatal condition. So he thought her edema was so severe that if he did not abort the fetus, the pregnancy would kill his patient. And so he describes what he did, disinfected her genitals, used forceps, and the introduction of successfully large probes to dilate her cervix, at which point, and I quote, "My finger could fully penetrate the cervix and then the uterus, and having accomplished this, I pushed my finger between the egg and the uterine wall and began to dislodge the egg from its side." The extraction was successful. He reported that the patient was healthy after the operation, but then he reported that she died a few days later. He said that it was not the condition, the operation, that provoked her death, but the terrible intoxicación that had first alarmed him. And I don't know which one it was. In an 1897 publication, Estrada, like Tajonar y Cardosa, advocated apparently successfully for physicians' performance of embryotomies. So this is in 1898, and he said that the medical school had outlawed them, but then I found that in 1900 they had become legal, so I think he intervened and it became an accepted position. So Mexican physicians continue to publish articles defending surgical abortions, most often in order to preserve the life of or health of a pregnant woman through the 1930s, and medical students, this is something Elizabeth O'Brien found, performed hundreds of uterine injections in Mexico City clinics on patients between 1880 and 1936. So that's injecting water into the uterus, which, as I described already, stimulated contraction. Some contemporary justifications for these procedures took inspiration from eugenics. And so I'm going to just give you a couple examples of this. One of them is from a doctor, Bernardo Gastelum, who was a former head of the National Department of Health and Social Services. He had been in that role early after the Mexican Revolution under the presidency of Calles. And then when Cardenas becomes president, he resigns, but he maintains that position in his home state of Sinaloa. And I found an article he published in 1934 in a journal in Yucatan called the Revista Médica. And it is really interesting because it's sort of laced full of references to eugenics. He talked about how the inhabitants of a healthy nation required income, sport, social relations, and culture to achieve social harmony, and the same was true in families. But he said that an additional child in a functioning family could disturb its tranquility, and the family would, if it grew endlessly, it would cause all sorts of social disarray. And so he said that doctors in small communities and big cities should all be prepared to know how to perform abortions to sort of provide social stability. And so he talks about how doctors and midwives might use a procedure that he called the brutal procedure of puncturing an egg. But he said that that was something they did, although he says it was quite successful. But he advocates a procedure that's very much like the one I described Estrada performing in 1898. So you dilate the cervix, stimulate contractions by breaking the amniotic sac or injecting water into it, and then normally using forceps or sometimes the doctor's hand to remove the product of conception. Various other contemporary physicians also alluded to eugenics in the 30s and into the 40s. One of them is Fernando Narvaez, who was writing in the Revista Médica de Yucatán in 1943. And he noted that the interruption of gestation was justified to save the life of a woman whose life or organs pregnancy threatened. But then he goes on to talk about procedures for doing this, and he celebrates a method that a doctor called E.A. Boero had publicized in 1935 that involved extracting the amniotic fluid from the womb with a syringe and replacing it with formaldehyde. And he says that this is a marvelous operation because it can be done, and I'm quoting him, without the awareness of the patient herself, which is very important because in this way emotional trauma is avoided. But in 1935 or 1943, somebody who is committing an abortion without the awareness or consent of a patient seems like in an environment of eugenics thinking, I'm making the connection there, but it seems like a fairly obvious connection. Okay, so that is the backdrop of this whole history of endorsing and providing abortion from the period of as early as the 1870s, 1880s, 90s, and up to the 40s. And that what I discovered in the early 1950s is what I'm calling here the conservative turn. That I found professional bodies and prominent physicians for the first time, there had been opponents earlier I alluded to at the beginning of my talk, but it becomes the kind of institutional norm to oppose the provision of abortion. And I'll just describe some of the evidence that I found about this. So at the 1952 meeting of the Assembly of Mexican Surgeons, two physicians, Luis Carrillo Azcarate and Joaquin Correa Cedillo from the Academia Mexicana de Medicina, announced a startling new perspective on the morality of abortion, rejecting the position that both 19th century legal medicine and even the penal code had taken, that a physician's obligation was to preserve a pregnant woman's life above that of her offspring. Carrillo and Correa proclaimed that the organization they represented had resolved that, quote, in no moment can it be accepted that the life of the mother is more important than that of the child. Their announcement marked a moment of change within circles of institutional medicine, which in the 1950s reversed a decades-old position of tacit support for abortion. By the early 1950s, physicians articulated increasing discomfort with the performance of therapeutic abortions. At the first national meeting of the gynecology, it's called the National Meeting of Gynecology and Obstetric Doctors in Monterey in June of 1950, a group of doctors also condemned the practice of therapeutic abortion. They decried the notion that it was a good idea to purposefully limit natality, which they said would lead Mexico into, quote, moral, economic, cultural, and social decadence. And they characterized all cases of abortion as homicide that combines the attenuating factors of premeditation, treachery, and self-interest. And further, they responded to the cases that I mentioned, the states that had allowed for abortion in the late 30s for economic reasons. They said there were never economic reasons why women sought abortions, and that most did it, quote, out of selfishness, guilt, vanity, cowardice, laziness, or weakness. They proposed that instead of allowing for abortions for medical reasons, that it shouldn't be just automatically assumed there were medical reasons, but there should be a whole procedure where several doctors are consulted, and then that the National Colegio Medico also gave its consent to the procedure. Another meeting the second year of the same society, same position is taken up, that abortion is described in that meeting as homicide in every case. And I'll mention one other example because I found it really striking, because it was from the same individual. So Bernardo Gastelum, who was the fellow I mentioned from 1934, who had talked about why there should be doctors in the Yucatan should all be equipped to perform abortion, somewhat partially for economic reasons. By 1958, he had just done a complete reversal. So he shows up at a meeting of the National Academy of Medicine in October of that year, and he presents a long paper discussing how the position in Europe and elsewhere in the Americas on abortion in medical communities was that there was no medical justification for abortion, that all of the medical conditions that had earlier justified abortion in cases of threats to women's life no longer existed, that the cures were so great that there was no reason to provide abortions anymore because those conditions could be addressed medically. And so he gives this talk, very long detailed talk about all of these conditions, and then several other doctors get up at the same meeting and applaud his conclusion, and there's a sort of general discussion and everybody seems to be on board. So that seemed like this very institutional reckoning, saying that the position had shifted. Okay, so in terms of a conclusion, what I've laid out is that from the 1870s through at least the 1940s, many doctors, either to aid women whose health, pregnancy, or birth endangered, or out of eugenic considerations, starting in the 30s, dedicated their energy and research expertise to refining techniques and teaching younger generations of doctors about the safest and most efficient methods for provoking and executing term and preterm surgical abortions. But in the mid-20th century, a number of prominent spokespeople and medical professions reversed this earlier support. Articles and speeches by doctors and surveys of and interviews with healthcare professionals in the second half of the 20th century document a turn toward the condemnation of abortion within professional medical circles. Medical students in the 70s and 80s and onward were not well informed about either the justification for abortion in cases of rape, for instance, nor were they instructed on, it sort of dropped from the curriculum in many places, on the procedures for performing surgical abortions. In fact, physicians' understanding that inducing the interruption of a pregnancy constituted homicide made them more disposed to denouncing suspected clandestine abortions or to blocking access to the procedure even when it was lawful. The sources examined here give some indication that doctors' newly asserted moral convictions explain the shift, and there's also the explanation they gave that it was because of developments in medical science. And there may have been, I don't want to dismiss that, there may have been some of that influencing them, but the changes also relate to broader issues. First, the 1940s was typified by a movement of state and social gender conservatism in comparison to the comparative radicalism of Mexico in the 1930s, when the country hosted 3 national congresses of women's and workers and peasant organizations. And in contrast, the most significant post-World War II women's political organization in Mexico, the Unión Nacional de Mujeres, denounced the use of birth control, let alone abortion. Marta Santillán Esqueda, who writes about abortion history in the 1930s to 50s, has studied a scandalous case, widely condemned in contemporary newspapers in the capital, of a doctor called González de la Vega, who was arrested in Mexico City in 1941 along with about 20 female patients and charged with providing 20 to 30 abortions daily to women in the capital. Santillán comments that contemporaries reporting on the case lay the blame for his patients' behavior and their demand for abortion at the door of, quote, modernization. As one columnist asserted, de la Vega's patients had misunderstood the idea of modernization in supposing that it implied, quote, spurning the home and the institution of marriage and replacing these with a faith in contraception and divorce. Historians have traced the shift in the political stance of the presidencies in the 1940s of Manuel Avila Camacho, 40 to 46, and his successor, Miguel Alemán Valdez, in such matters as economic redistribution, agrarian reform, and press censorship. As one contemporary journalist, Carlos de Negri, observed, with the assumption of the Alemán presidency, he lamented, the revolution has gotten off its horse and into a Cadillac. And this shift that he described also translates to broader social views about gender and about abortion. And the second thing is that this was happening in a decade in which the state was exerting a much greater control over doctors' professional autonomy and was also becoming the central agency in providing health care in the country. The final point that I'm going to make about the consideration of today's framework about abortion, and I mentioned this earlier, but I want to return to it for a moment, is that rarely in the conversation about this, in this time of the conservative turn, does the question of the status of the fetus emerge. Instead, as in most of the examples I quoted here, the concerns involve judgments about the moral and sexual behavior of pregnant women. In the 1930s, the post-revolutionary state, addressing the dramatic depopulation of the country in the wake of a 10-year civil war, embraced the idea of child welfare in its adoption of an imperative to support child and maternity health in state-funded and eugenics-inspired puericulture programs. But even in those, there's virtually no discussion of the inherent value of human life or the inherent rights of unborn embryos and fetuses. These ideas were not part of the discourse. And the discourse of fetal personhood or fetal humanity that is so present in the debates about abortion in our own period do not emerge in Mexico, as I think is also the case internationally, until the 1980s. So it's a very, very recent conversation. This is illustrated just in this one last shot I have. which unfortunately the year is cut off from the date there, but it's 1980. And so this is just showing you this ad for coming to a rally to discuss abortion, you know, like the terrible scourge of abortion. And it's a campaign, pro-vida, pro-life campaign, affiliated with the PAN, the right-wing Catholic party in Mexico. And this is the decade that that kind of language and that kind of mobilization affiliated explicitly with the Catholic Church arrives on the scene. And it arrives on the scene not because of the kind of eruption of a centuries-old Catholic defense of unborn life or fetal souls. It arrives in direct response to the mobilization of feminist groups in the late 1970s, 80s, and 90s who are actually influencing state legislatures to reform their penal codes. And that's the decade in which abortion law starts to expand. It takes off in 2000 and then in 2007, but there start actually being changes in abortion laws in Mexico in the late 1970s. And that's when the discourse of like sort of fetal personhood starts to become circulated. So I will close with that point and welcome any questions you might have. Yes, please.
Thank you so much for that talk. It was so interesting, and I feel like I've got about 20 questions, but I'll try and limit myself to like 1.5. But my question is, in these discussions of abortion, I'm wondering if there was any medical discussions of sterilization. And I'm thinking especially, you know, the example you give, which is sort of disturbing about the formaldehyde in the womb. Like if some of the intention of maybe these like pseudo-eugenic sort of procedures was to sterilize as well as to abort, or if there was any kind of discussion of women wanting to be sterilized, to not have children, or you know, how that went. And then I guess my other question was about Catholicism, and I think it's a really interesting point that you draw here in terms of, you know, it maybe not being as influential as we would think. But in these early sort of court trials about abortion that you're saying, like people are rarely actually penalized, is there any religious presence in those court proceedings, or is it something that is seen as like not at all within the purview of religious authorities?
Sure. Okay, so let me just write down purview of religious authorities. Okay, so the first question, that you're right, that description of formaldehyde does sound like the language that would, it's like the right era and procedure for sterilization. But that's the only one that I came across that sounds like that actually. In the case of Mexico, one state in Mexico passes a eugenic law in the 30s. It's Veracruz, and they pass a law allowing for sterilization. And Alex Stern, she has an article about it. I forget the name of it, but if you look up Alex Stern and sterilization in 30s in Veracruz, you'll find it. So that happens. It's kind of thought of as an exception. Most of Mexico's embracing of eugenics is this sort of like the positive eugenics, where they want to like combat alcoholism or crime, and it's all this language about changing the society to reduce the conditions that would create deviant people. But there is that one case, and I think that's the only one I know about. The Catholicism question, it comes up very rarely. In the earliest cases that I looked at for abortion, so this is going back to Reproduction and Its Discontents, actually it goes back to when I was writing my dissertation on the false mystics. So those involved Inquisition cases. And every once in a while, I was looking at a different kind of religious deviant, but once in a while, somebody who seemed to either said they were having an abortion or I could tell was having an abortion would show up in an Inquisition trial. And the Inquisition really didn't care. They would never pursue it. They never question it. I even found a priest in, it was like 1780s, who shows up at the Inquisition court and says, I have impregnated daughters of confession and I have given them abortifacient substances. I want to unburden my guilt. Please prosecute me. And they send him away. Come back when you've done something interesting. There are decrees against it in the papacy issues, one in the 16th century, one in the 17th. And the church says, yes, we oppose this, but they never act on it. And in criminal trials, it comes up very, very infrequently. I found one trial, I think it's in the article that David mentioned, that was in Puebla, and it's like in the 1850s. And a woman is accused of abortion, and the judge chastises her and says, don't you know that your baby your baby wasn't baptized, so your baby's going straight to hell, and that's terrible, and that's the grave sin. And that stood out to me, and I thought, oh, maybe I'm in Puebla. Puebla's considered the most Catholic conservative state, maybe next to Querétaro in Mexico, and so maybe this is a thing that's going on here, but I only found that one case. So I would say generally, it really doesn't show up. And the judges, I gotta hand it to them. Like this project made me feel a lot better about men in the 19th century. I was like, doctors and judges. Sometimes I agree with them. Like the judges they were like, what's the evidence? They would weigh the evidence and they'd say, well, we can't convict, there's not enough evidence here. And so I didn't find them being, engaged in kind of Catholic moral conversation.
Thank you so much.
Nancy?
Thank you, Nora, for such a great talk. You mentioned that in the 50s, the conservative turn begins to talk about abortion as homicide.
Yeah.
And so that's, in my mind, assuming that there is a life to kill.
Yeah.
And so is there two parts? Is there any discussion at that stage of what the life is? Like, does the life begin at conception or later on in gestational stages?
Yeah.
And secondly, when the PON comes on the scene in 1980s, are they linking pro-life or fetus rights with this homicide discourse? In other words, there is a life and the life is being killed.
Yeah. They definitely do. I mean, so the 19, I found it, I was sort of tracing it, and this stuff I'm trying to trace, I should say, I did a lot of the research for this during COVID, so it's what I could find in newspapers that I had access to and in publications. But I was looking in, and I got some of the Pro Vida, they have some books and things, so I was able to get some of those. And it does definitely show up starting, in the 70s and 80s, and they definitely make that link, that it's homicide, and the link is also that they start it sort of starts out where the fetus or the product of conception is a being. They first refer to it as a being, and then it's a creation or something, and then by the 1980s, it's a child. And it also comes up in that period because of the whole fertilization industry and the creation of artificial test tube productions. In Mexico becomes a place that has that industry and is sometimes also an experimental location for companies in the United States who are experimenting on women in Mexico. And then there's this whole question of what happens to all of the fetuses that aren't developed, but who were fertilized. So one of the leaders of Pro Vida calls all of those the fetuses or the eggs that aren't developed, they're all children, and he describes it as them all being killed, massive homicide. So they definitely make that connection. You're right, in the 50s, in those instances where they start saying all homicide is, all abortion is homicide, that does presume. So that kind of, maybe I need to tone down my argument that it really only starts in the 80s. I guess it's just there's a presumption, but that language of like, the rights of the baby, it doesn't really emerge. And most of the energy is really visited upon what's the behavior of the women. So like, I found interviews and surveys with doctors, that sociologists, and that kind of work is going on in the 60s and 70s, and there's sometimes like interviewing them about what do they do when they think there's a suspected case of abortion, and their concerns are always about the mother's behavior. So like they'll sort of use this language about, I had to figure out who she was or what was her behavior, and they don't really talk about it as, I was worried about the rights of the undefended. So that's an evaluation I made about where everyone's energy is directed toward. Maybe I'll just go down the line here. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Edward, and I'm a PhD student here. Thank you for that. So I'm wondering, you mentioned, I think, that this change in legislation reflected somewhat a change in attitude, broadly speaking. I'm wondering if you have any evidence that can give us a sense of what people thought, as a consensus during the late 19th century, early 20th century. Is there a way to know this, and particularly with respect to women? Because I think most, if not all, of the sources that you showed us were the voices of men.
Right.
So I'd be interested to know what women had to say about this.
Yeah.
How they thought of abortion, how they might have defined it, or just
Right.
anything.
Right. Well, their voices, the only place that I could find them are in criminal trials. And so, yeah, and that's something, I didn't talk about that here. I studied criminal trials from about 4 or 5 different states in Mexico. I guess I would say that the overwhelming impression I get about women who are accused of, first of all, hardly anybody accused of abortion says, oh yeah, I intentionally aborted. They usually say, I had a miscarriage, or they might say, yeah, that I had taken something to regularize my menses. They more often will acknowledge, so the crimes of abortion and infanticide are very closely linked and sometimes indistinguishable. Like in one case, the judge will call the same crime by both names. In infanticide cases, women more often will acknowledge that the crime happened, or they'll say, so those are the only ones where I can see where somebody might actually acknowledge doing it and provide a motivation. And usually, what I would say I was struck by is the absence of sentimentality about it. It's, you don't find a lot of people, at least in the way, it's a court transcript, it's a very loaded situation always, so maybe I'm not getting what they were thinking inside. But in the record, you don't have people coming and saying, I'm so sorry, I did this terrible thing, it was a sin. They're very, very matter of fact about something like, I was working, I can think of one example of a woman, so this is an infanticide case. I was working in the mill by the river. I gave birth. I had to be at work an hour earlier. I left my baby in the field, and at 5 o'clock that day I went back with a coworker, and the baby was dead. But she just describes it like, what else would I do? Those were my circumstances, and I did that. So, yeah, that's the overwhelming thing that I feel, and something I said in Reproduction and Its Discontents was that I feel like in our era, there's so much attention, so much focus, so much of a commercial industry around it. It's so central, preparation for everything. and for a lot of people in this period, it wasn't something that, it was very part of daily life and something to be gotten out of the way with and carry on with, or not, depend, like either way, whether you had the birth or you had something else. It was just a part of one's day or a part of one's year, and so not sort of inflated in its importance, I guess.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So Rebecca, and I teach at Queens. I really enjoyed your talk, and I have two questions. One, it struck me that the medical sort of justification, the medical conversation, the discussions that you were able to chart, were fairly narrowly construed in the sense of abortion was legitimate when it was protecting the health,
Yeah.
when a woman's health was at risk. And I wonder if so much of our contemporary discussion is also about the risks when an abortion isn't provided and someone goes to other means. You've talked about the medicinal means available, but is there
Yeah.
any record of and then discussion of illegal abortions?
Yeah.
And the danger that presents to women's health, and therefore a broader discussion of health?
Yeah.
So that's my first question. My second question was, I think it was Gaston, who you presented as articulating in the 1930s a vision that you framed as eugenics, and I didn't see the eugenic dimension in what you presented, and but it struck me that his argument as he presented it could have been read as providing married women with an actual legitimate reason to seek an abortion. And that struck me as that seemed to be the category of women who had no recourse,
Right.
higher punishments, unless they had a health risk. But the idea that I have too many children and I simply can't handle more, that, you know, there's a social, an argument to be made. So
Right. Okay, so first on the health risks of illegal abortions, I would say it doesn't show up in these publications about like these medical theses and that kind of thing. I'm just trying to think if, the only place that it comes, that I've seen it is in like newspaper articles or sometimes criminal investigations where a woman shows up at the hospital with exhibiting symptoms because of the ramifications of usually, it could be either a surgical or medicinal abortion that led to excessive hemorrhaging. So that comes up. And in those cases, generally, the only reference I've seen to it is then usually the hospital then refers the woman to, like they'll denounce her for a criminal investigation. But people aren't saying, oh, what about the fact of there being, a loss of life or that kind of thing. I mean, this I will say this is, I have not borne this out with extensive medical research, but my supposition is that this is because the medicinal abortions from the plants I mentioned too, but there are others, as far as I can tell, are quite effective and not very risky. Like there are some where they are risky, but people aren't going and having surgical abortions that lead to infection and lead to, the kinds of problems that those could produce. They're usually doing medicinal abortions and they usually do them early on, and they're not very, it's sort of like having a heavy period. They're not that dramatic. So I suspect that may be one reason why it doesn't show up that often. The Gastelum thing about was he a eugenicist? So I think the reason I said that was that his article's about, 10 pages long, and the first part of it is it's all of this thing about family finances, but also it's this sort of language about how to have a healthy society, and it's not direct. Again, it's not this sort of direct, like we got to purge the degenerate people or something. but it is this idea of like sport, clean living, and so it's like the healthy, what I call the positive eugenics frame that is typical of Mexico, and that's how I found it infused in his language, not because he was saying we should sterilize various people, but I think that's a really good point that I hadn't thought about, that on the other hand, he is acknowledging the situation for married women. And he is publishing this. It's interesting because he publishes it in this journal in Yucatan, although he's from Sinaloa, and as far as I know, is in Sinaloa at the time. But Yucatan is one of the states that had decriminal, or had lessened the penalties for women who were married and had 2 or 3 children. And they still have that. There are 2 states in Mexico now where, so every state in Mexico at the present moment has a different code because everyone has their own penal code. So there's a whole range of what's lawful. But Yucatan is one of the places where for women who have 3 or more children and are facing economic difficulty, they can lawfully have an abortion. And so that may be why he's publishing there and addressing that issue.
I was wondering about, when your presentation talked about the conservative turn in the 1950s,
Yeah.
if this was also reflected in the outcomes of court trials, and if there was like harsher prosecution and sentencing,
Yeah.
or what was the relationship between medical professionals having a certain ideology and then that being
Yeah.
reflected in courts?
Unfortunately, I discovered as a historian who works on, who used to be a colonialist, then moved into the 19th century, and now I'm into the 20th century. And I discovered one of the frustrations that I'm sure other historians of the 20th century have had, which is privacy protection rights mean you cannot access criminal cases for 50 years. So I have no idea because I hired a research assistant because I found out about the state of Sonora in 1936 changed its penal code very explicitly to include a statement about eugenics in its code, where it said, like, so I told you about the 1931 code that it said if a fetus was going to die, it was okay to abort, but that state says, we have a eugenics code now, and I was like, oh my God, like it's so explicit, and so I wanted to find out what happened in criminal trials, and I hired a research assistant who found 1 or 2 abortion cases, and he had to wait around for 6 months till the 50 years passed to read one of them. And that one didn't, then it turned out it had no, it was a partial case and it had no reference to eugenics. So one answer I'd say is I don't know, because I can't access them. I do, here's the thing that I do know from some secondary literature I've read, is that, so apparently in the, probably, I don't know for the 50s, 60s, 70s and onward, the number that I've read is that at least 1 million women a year were having abortions in Mexico. It was probably larger. Those are the numbers that the state acknowledges. And in that time period, very, very few cases are prosecuted. So I said that there's this bigger prosecution in the 20s. It's almost like an inverse correlation. So there are doctors performing abortions, and there are more criminal investigations, although not for the crimes that doctors are performing. And then after the 30s, at least in terms of investigations in the courts that I've looked at the catalogs. I can't see the cases, but I've looked at the catalogs, and the numbers are tiny. And this, he was the former head of the human rights organization in Mexico City, a lawyer who was a pro-abortion lawyer. He calls abortion in the later part of the 20th century the crime that is not prosecuted. And I had some statistic, not in this paper, but elsewhere, where he says that in like 1975 there were 4 women being investigated for abortion. In like 1985 there are 6. Like it's millions of abortions happening, or 1 million happening, and like a dozen people prosecuted. So it's kind of odd, the correlation, and I don't know of those small numbers how many were convicted, but I just know it doesn't start being something, again, that is dramatically prosecuted until the 80s and 90s. And there, I do know that there was, when Mexico City liberalizes its abortion law in a few stages. One of them is in 2000, and there's another 2007, which decriminalizes first trimester abortion. And in dramatic response to that, several things happen, and one of them is that a bunch of states start passing constitutions that say life begins at conception. And the other thing that happens is women start getting investigated for abortion a lot more often. So there's like a big jump, but it doesn't happen until 2000. So that's what I got.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Jose. I'm PhD here student. I was thinking about this conservative term,
Yeah.
and if you see like any connections, I don't know that you talk about that Catholicism is not seed like eventually, but I'm thinking like, for example, in 1941, I think it was created the Legion of Christ, like Legionario de Cristo by Marcel Maciel. I know that Marcel Maciel was super close friend with John Paul II. So I know that they have like a lot of power, like as a congregation.
Yeah.
And also they like in some way install in these like wealthy families in Mexico. So I don't know if you see this connection between this conservative term and this kind of movement, like conservative Catholicism movement that appear like in Latin America. I'm thinking like in the Legionario de Cristo, but also like in the Opus Dei, in terms of this like problem that they have with the liberation theology, for example. This like kind of fight inside the Catholicism and how that influence. I'm thinking in this because like the argument that they use, like the protection of unborn child, is like the argument that, for example, happen in other places, like in Latin America. I'm thinking in Chile, for example. And I know that maybe they are not like super exposed in terms of institution, but in some way they acted throughout these members. Like, for example, the medical practitioners who are like Catholic. Or something like that. I don't know if you see something related with that.
Well, I think one thing that makes Mexico unique is because of the secularism, first from the 19th century, and then with the revolution, sort of the degree of prohibition on the church's power after the revolution, that the church is forbidden from playing a political role in directing the state or even making pronouncements about, state matters. And so that, I feel like the church becomes gagged for a lot of the 20th century until Salinas really, revises the Constitution in, I forget if it's 93, but he has one of his many revisions to the 1917 Constitution was to say the church now is allowed to be released. And it seems like before that period, what happens is this kind of indirect influence that the church has to take through, like maybe partly through doctors. I was thinking about something else when you were talking about kind of indirect influence. Is it still there? It's drifting back of my mind. I can't remember what I was going to say, but I feel like I feel like you're right. It is organizing and trying to reach populations, but it can't do it in the most explicit ways that it would like to do. Although I do have, there is a source I haven't consulted that a historian just told me about recently that I need to look at, which is because I can find them online again, the proclamations of the meetings of the Mexican bishops. I guess those are available, and I may find that they are defying, because the person I talked to said, oh yeah, they were having some influence. The thing is that one of the places I was looking is, I was using the national, so those of you who are trying to conduct some of your research online, Mexico has a newspaper database at the UNAM, which has newspapers from all over the country, searchable online. Some of them are only searchable in person, so you have different kinds of access. But I was looking at these moments when I knew there was sort of like a sort of international decree or statement to see, you know, were people talking about it in Mexico? How much circulation did it have? And so one of them was this decree from 1930, another papal bull. I'm not going to remember the name of it, but it was about the sanctity of marriage, and it condemned homosexuality and contraception and promoted marriage. I forget its name, but the Archbishop, whose name I also forget, in 1930 wrote this letter, and it did get some traction, and so some people started writing about it, but I noticed that it's a different organization from the one you mentioned. It's the Unión de Padres de Familia that was founded at the era of the Cristero Revolt. They don't seem to, like, they talk about the 1930 bull, but they don't talk about abortion. They just talk about marriage. And I looked through I could find that organization had a catalog, and I haven't been to see the Unión de Padres de Familia, but I was able to look at their catalog, and it had one abortion document in it, and it was pro vida, and it was from 1985. So it does seem like it comes late for whatever reason. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I guess if we could thank Nora.